Well, so there's a handful of things to pick up on, and Jim, please jump in whenever you'd like. But people might have heard of these different groups, and some people inside or outside the PCA might have different opinions about such groups existing. We'll come back to this a little bit later, but just for historical context, this is my new gig here. And to tie in with your Justice for Machen thing, J. Gresham Machen was involved in a lot of stuff, obviously in the 20s and 30s. But in 1935, he wrote an article in the Presbyterian Guardian titled "The Purpose of the Covenant Union." And I'll post a link to that in the episode description. But there was an organization prior to the existence of the OPC, or the first PCA, the PC of A. The OPC was sued, obviously, for taking that name, and the PCUSA, through legal means, forced them to adopt a new name, which ended up being the OPC. But Machen established, with others, a group within the PCUSA to try to maintain orthodoxy, maintain its purpose and mission. But what ended up happening is, once it was determined that reformation from within the church was not going to happen, certainly the boards of the church were not going to be altered and swayed, that organization, the Presbyterian Constitutional Covenant Union, ended up, I don't want to overinterpret this, but it ended up becoming the proto-OPC. It wasn't a shadow church in that sense. It wasn't like a sleeper cell within. Some people might have thought of it that way, but it was an affinity group within the PCUSA, which eventually many of the people involved in that went off to form the OPC, what would become the OPC. Let me read to you just the four main principles here, and we'll come back connecting this to the modern day, hopefully to add some more context to groups like more in the PCA, the National Partnership, and the Gospel Reformation Network, and how those are similar or different from what was going on in 1935. Machen writes, "The Constitution of the Presbyterian Constitutional Covenant Union contains three principal articles in which the purpose and character of the union is set forth. These are Articles 2, 3, and 4. Article 2 sets forth the occasion for the forming of the union. The occasion is the increasing dominance of modernism in the Presbyterian Church in the USA. Article 3 sets forth the purpose of the union. The purpose is to maintain the constitution of the Presbyterian Church in the USA against the assaults of modernism. Article 4 contains the pledge or covenant to be subscribed to by those who are members of the union. The pledge obligates the members of the union to maintain a true Presbyterian church, either by reform of the Presbyterian Church in the USA or, failing that, by continuing the true succession of that church separately from the existing modernist indifferentist organization." Not every fundamentalist was on board with that. We should say it caused a rift, even at Westminster Seminary, where the board members were favorable, obviously, towards a seminary existing distinct from the official seminary at Princeton, which had become modernist influenced. But not everyone was supportive of beginning a new church. They didn't think it was time yet, at least. And so that led to eventually a showdown between the faculty and the board at Westminster. The faculty said, "Look, if you're not on board with this, we're all going to resign." And so the board resigned. And that led to, among other things, the formation of the Presbyterian Guardian. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Hopefully, the conversation we can have maybe with Daryl Hart and also with Dominic Aquila. But to bring things back to the present day, Brad, it's interesting because I imagine most people, I did not know much about the PCCU until just maybe a year ago. I stumbled upon it doing some work reading through the Guardian. But these organizations are nothing new. But tell us a bit about the different approaches, because we can go all the way from a sleeper cell or even a caucus, for example, where there might be a private organization and the leadership of that organization tells the members or whips the members into voting a certain way at General Assembly, versus all the way on the other end might just be something as lightweight as, a group of people that get together for dinner and just encourage one another. So obviously, both of these three organizations I've mentioned are, somewhere in between them, or maybe not even on the spectrum. But how would you see that? I mean, what are your thoughts on that and connecting things back to Machen and the necessity of the PCCU at the time?
Well, I would hasten to point out that the situation of what we would call confessionalist or conservatives or traditionalists.
We're not dealing with modernism, so-called.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The old. So our situation is not analogous to Machen's, nor is it analogous to the old Southern Church, the PCUS, from which the PCA came.
Correct.
Founded in 1973.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some interesting parallels between moves made in the Northern Church in the 20s and 30s, and then things that were happening, a decade later or two in the Southern Church. There's a lot of crying about, there's this website or that blog or this podcast or another.
Yeah, now we're one of them.
Right. And
talking to you.
Yes. But there was a journal called the Presbyterian Journal, founded in 1942, to fight modernism and declension in the Southern Church. G. Aiken Taylor was the founder. That's a name some people have heard. There was an organization of laymen, mostly ruling elders, I gather, formed in 1964 in the Southern Church. And it was instrumental to the founding of the PCA, but they first were trying to reform the PCUS, the old Southern Church. And there was a group of ministers, the Presbyterian Churchmen United, that formed in 1967. And there was also a group called Presbyterian Evangelistic Fellowship that was formed in the late 50s. And, it was over the concern that, there was no evangelism, or it's sort of analogous to the Independent Board for Foreign Missions, that Machen founded.
Mm-hmm.
So those four groups were a big part in like the really early 70s of the basis for the new denomination. So laymen were involved, pastors were involved, media, and then, just a parachurch organization like an evangelistic outreach group. So those things were all done in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and they were in for a long fight. And it proved to be unsuccessful when they felt it necessitated the formation of the PCA in 1973. But I always repeat, there are no theological liberals in the PCA.
Yeah.
And I can say that because I know I'm well acquainted with Machen and what he faced, and this is not the same thing. But there have been guys who have tried to say that what we are up against in the PCA is analogous in some ways. There's no denial of supernatural Christianity or the inerrancy of Scripture, but there are two ways at least of looking at the mission of the church, and the big deal. I mean, Todd described it in his article as latitude. And of course, that goes along with what's called good faith subscription that came in around 2002, which kind of formalized how we handle exceptions to the standards. But latitude, there's a broader and a narrower emphasis depending on which side you're on, but also contextualization. I wrote about that recently, and in other words, it's how you do outreach and how you shape the church for a given context to try to reach a certain part of the culture or a certain kind of person. And that's sort of over against what we often call, and you'll hear the GRN use this phrase, ordinary means of grace ministry, which is, focused primarily on the Lord's Day and on the proclamation of the word, the teaching of it, and the sacraments. Yeah. So that's sort of the divide. It's somewhat between city and country, or you might view it as being between kind of a blue suburbs and red suburbs. The PCA was diverse at its founding. We all recognize that. There were old school Presbyterians. There were conservative evangelicals. There were truly people who didn't like segregation and had some racial issues, and that's one of the reasons they wanted out. There were some people that were disturbed by things in the culture like the sexual revolution and the Vietnam War and the reactions to those things. So all those things were factors. There were probably 5 or 6 definable factions that formed the PCA, but we have exactly the same doctrinal standards as the OPC, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
and we have what is probably an old school book of church order. So whatever we were when we were founded, our bones are old school Presbyterian, spirituality of the church, ordinary means of grace. But we never have all agreed that that's the way to go.
Yeah.
And we certainly have a variety of practice and expression today.
Yeah, and you guys need to get your directory for public worship in there as a constitutional document. So I'm advocating. I'm stumping for that right now. So I'll take the heat for you. But
that's not going to happen. This is something. What we're just talking about the PCA here. When our members travel across the country, a lot of them have learned that just looking up the nearest PCA church and wherever they may be traveling can lead to some very interesting experiences.
Oh yeah,
because we have such a range of worship and types of churches.
Mm-hmm.
It's always been my feeling that in some of the other denominations, conservative reform denominations, especially the OPC, there's a lot more uniformity in worship and the type of sermon you might hear, what you might see up front at the church, and so diversity is good in some ways, but I sometimes think that there can be too much, and that worship has to be one of the things that binds us together. And if there's such a variety of worship, you may have de facto variety of communions.